The topic sentence in this first paragraph introduces what's probably the subject, the question of whether music and language originated together. It doesn't get answered here, though. We just get a bunch of similarities. And so as I go into the next paragraph, I'm going to be paying attention to whether or not this question gets answered. The topic sentence in this second paragraph is talking about the brain and how language and music use the same brain system. So again, we're continuing with similarities, emphasizing that there are fewer differences than similarities again, and then hitting us with this analogy, how music and language are like two radio stations playing over the same hardware, and that's because they're using like the same brain system. I think that's like the radio hardware in this analogy. They finally hit us with a difference though. Language is easier for most people because they can both perform and compose language as well as listen to it, whereas with music, most everybody can listen to it, but many people are not so gifted when it comes to performing or composing it. So we're going to just remember that as language is easier to give and receive. In music, people are good at receiving, but not so much giving. So we've got a difference here, but we haven't answered our original question of whether they originated at the same time. So I'm expecting the third paragraph to address that. The topic sentence of this third paragraph seems to provide a pretty good answer to our question. If they evolved together, that sort of means that they arose at the same time. At least I think that's a reasonable way to interpret it. And then they point out, or the author points out, that the fact that we're better at language suggests that it is the thing that has real evolutionary advantage. It's the primary function that natural selection operated on. Language is why we have this brain system, and music just kind of rode its coattails in. So the point here is that they arose together, but language is really the driver, and music doesn't so much have a lot of evolutionary advantage associated with it. So now let's answer any questions that are pertaining to passage A only, and then we should dive into passage B. The topic sentence in passage B has a quote from Darwin about music, and Darwin is saying that the enjoyment of music and the ability to make music, so listening to it and making it, neither of those seem to have any practical use to man, and so they're mysterious. Darwin is echoing this idea from the end of passage A that music has little adaptive value and must have come along with language. That's the real valuable asset that natural selection operated on. So Darwin believes the same thing essentially, but then the author takes it in the entire other direction. The author says the enjoyment and the ability to make music are of indispensable use to mothers and their infants. So the author is going to argue that music does have some evolutionary value, and we can tell that right here. This seems to be the main idea. Because it's controversial and it's going against Darwin and it's going against passage A, this is almost certainly going to end up being our main point, our main conclusion. And so we're going to be looking for evidence for it. The author is going to argue that the value in music has something to do with mothers and infants and the emotional bonds created. That is why music has adaptive value. So I'm expecting to hear more about this in the coming paragraphs. The topic sentence in the second paragraph is talking about the relationship between mothers and infants. And it says there's a lot of interaction, both visual, vocal, facial, and bodily, all kinds of interaction on a constant basis from when the child is born up until 6 months. And then there's some research introduced here. Researchers have shown that they jointly construct these improvisations and they track one another's actions. It could be very short to 3 seconds, which is still pretty short. And they have musical elements, variations, and these are all musical qualities: pitch, rhythm, timbre, volume, and tempo. And so the author's building out his or her argument that music is going to be an essential part of these interactions, and therefore it's an evolutionary advantage to have it. I'm expecting to hear this argument build in the next paragraph. The topic sentence in this third paragraph asks the question, which is basically the main idea here: what evolutionary advantage could music have? And music in the context of these interactions from babies that are really young, 0 to 6 months. And here comes the author's answer. Apparently, with our evolution, human or hominid evolution, the birth canal has gotten increasingly smaller while our heads have gotten larger. Our heads have gotten larger as we've gotten smarter. I'm not sure. Oh, our increase in bipedality. So something about the way we walk around has caused the birth canal to narrow as head sizes have increased, leaving our babies increasingly helpless at birth. And so this period, 0 to 6 months, which they talked about in the previous paragraph, suddenly becomes much more relevant. That's the new extra helpless phase of babyhood, and music is argued to be an advantage during that period. The author saying mothers who had the ability to make and enjoy music, I guess mothers and babies, it would be an advantage for both of them, and of course we're talking about evolution, they both have the genes for it, and the author's arguing that a mother and baby that have those genes is going to be better off than a mother and baby that don't. And there is the evolutionary advantage of music, according to passage B, and the main idea is simply that music has an evolutionary advantage. Let's sum both of these passages up. This is the second passage from the June 2007 LSAT. It is the social science passage. It's also one of the first examples of a comparative passage. This LSAT was released in 2007 specifically to give students an idea of what the comparative passage was going to look like, or to update the free LSAT. That's around the time that they introduced that. And so here you see one of the earliest examples of it. We always want to think about how passage A and B relate. And so here, passage A was about music and language, and the author was arguing that they evolved together, but language had all the value. Whereas the author in passage B is focused entirely on music, and he or she thinks that music also has evolutionary advantage, not arguing really anything about language, but their points about music are in direct contradiction. And so as far as the relationship between A and B, they disagree strongly about whether music has evolutionary value or not. So A is about music and language. It's persuasive. The author's making an argument that they evolved together, but language has all the value. And so the purpose is going to be to make that argument, or to build that argument. And the author is kind of, I guess, a slightly negative attitude towards music, kind of dismissive. Whereas in passage B, we're talking exclusively about music. It's still persuasive. The author is arguing that music does have some evolutionary advantage, especially for babies from 0 to 6 months, and gives an argument as to why that time period is increasingly sensitive as humans have evolved. And so the purpose is to make that argument that music does have value, and this author seems much more positive about the potential of music to have an evolutionary advantage. Let's dive into the questions. Number 9 is asking us to find a question that both passages were written primarily in order to answer. So it has to be a question they both address, and it has to be like a central question associated with their main point or primary purpose. They both talk about music. A says it has evolutionary advantage, and B says it doesn't. So that's a question they both address that's pretty central to both passages. That's what I would anticipate. And as I look at the answer choices, I'm first going to ask myself, is this addressed by both passages? And if it is, I'll ask, is it central? So let's see. What evolutionary advantage did bigger brain size give early hominids? Well, A definitely didn't address that at all, and I don't really think it was central to B. What do human mothers and infants, or why do they engage in bonding behavior that has musical elements? Only B talked about that. A didn't talk about mothers and infants. What are the evolutionary origins of the human ability to make music? A says it tags along with language. B says it has its own advantage. It has its own value with mothers and infants. So they have different answers to this question, but they both answer it. And I feel like the answers are very close to their main ideas. That music tagged along with language but isn't central, that's pretty much the main point in A. And the idea that music has evolutionary advantage because it helps out mothers and infants, that's pretty much the main point in B. I'd get on board with this. Let's get out of D and E though. Do the abilities to make music and use language depend on the same neurological systems? A addresses that. It's not central though, and B doesn't address it at all. Why are most people more adept at using language than making music? A acknowledges it that they are, doesn't really, it explains why, because language is primary. So A answers this. I don't really think I would say it's central, and B doesn't address it. And so C is addressed by both and central to both. That's why it's the right answer. Question 10 is asking us to find something that is mentioned in both passages as having a relationship to music. So it's got to be stated in each of the passages. And the one thing that I recall is that both passages mention that music came around the same time our brains started getting bigger. It was mentioned around line 20 in passage A, and then passage B mentioned it as part of the motivation for music being an advantage because our brains were getting bigger as the birth canal got smaller, our infants were more helpless, and that's where music's supposed to have its evolutionary advantage. So that's what I would be hunting for. But the criteria for a right answer is it's got to be mentioned in both passages. You got to be able to put your finger on where that relationship is discussed. So bonding between humans is a guaranteed in B, but it's not in A. I went back and looked. It'd be okay if you didn't go back and look. It's all right to, you generally want to look at all 5 before you do any serious hunting, because serious hunting takes time. And what if one of these is obvious? What if one of them is what you were looking for? So get a good look at everything before you spend too much time hunting for one of these. Now, human emotion, I feel like we talked about music. That's how the babies and mothers connect. And I think it was also mentioned at the very beginning of passage A. So that might be worth a look back. I like this, like 7 out of 10. I'd probably go hunt for it. Neurological research, I think that was just mentioned in A. The increasing helplessness. So there was research in B, but it wasn't brain scans. That's what neurological is. It was like mother-infant interaction with photos. Remember, they took photos of them at really high frame rates. The increasing helplessness of infants, that's going to be B only. And the use of tools to produce sounds, I feel like that was A only. They talk about how tools can be used to produce both music and language. That was one of their similarities. But neither of these are mentioned in both. Neurological research is in A only, and sure enough, you'll find human emotion up in the first sentence of passage A, and it's all over passage B in terms of building the bond between mother and infant, and so B is the answer choice you want to get into. Question 11 is asking us for something that the authors of these two passages would disagree over, most likely to disagree over, and it says it can be inferred. You always want to notice on disagree questions when it's been softened up a little bit. Other times it'll say there's a stated disagreement. On LR it does that as well. So here just has to be strongly implied that one would say yes and the other would say no. That's going to be our criteria. Now they have a fundamental disagreement about music. A says it doesn't really have evolutionary value, where B says it does. That's kind of a disagreement in their main points. That's what I would go looking for first. But as we filter the answer choices, we're going to ask who would say yes, who would say no. The increase in hominid brain size necessitated earlier bursts. B says yes, but I don't think A says no. This isn't a disagreement. Fewer differences than similarities exist between the neurological processing of music and human language. A says yes, but I don't think B addresses this. B doesn't talk about language at all, as far as I can recall. Brain size increased rapidly over the course of human evolution. They would probably maybe both agree with that. I don't see that being a source of disagreement. They both agree that brain size increased. I don't know about rapidly, but I can't see them disagreeing over that. I wouldn't spend the time to look for it. I'm still looking for something where I have a pretty clear yes and a pretty clear no. The capacity to produce music has great adaptive value to humans. Here we go. B says yes, helps mothers and infants in a serious way. A says no, it just rode the coattails of language. D is the one you want to like. Let's talk ourselves out of E though. Mother-infant bonding involves temporally patterned vocal interactions. B is going to say yes, and A won't have addressed it. So D is the best answer. Number 12 is asking us to find a question that both authors would agree to the answer on regarding music. And this is a bit of a surprising question because the authors seem to fundamentally disagree about music and whether it has evolutionary value. So there may be some side point about music that they do agree about, but they disagree about it in their main points. And so both authors just have to have the same answer to the question. It doesn't have to be that they both say yes. I suppose they could both say no. They just have to be on the same side. So we got to get an opinion from both of them. Does it manifest itself in some form in early infancy? Well, in the listening form, B would say yes, mothers and infant interaction. But I don't think A has an opinion on this at all. So that's the reason they're not going to agree about it. Does it affect the strength of mother-infant bonds? Same situation. B says yes, A has no opinion about it. So we need two yeses. Or two no's. Is it at least partly a result of evolutionary increases in brain size? Well, they both correlate it there, right? They both talk about how it came around the times our brain started getting bigger. And in fact, yeah, I think because the increasing brain size was due to language in A. Let's just scoot up there really quick. Because in B, it's definite yes, right? It's the birth canal problem caused music to have an evolutionary advantage. Yeah, and so they evolved together as brain size increased over the course of hominid evolution. That's a pretty good yes for C. I like that, like 8 or 9 out of 10. Evolving together as this happened is pretty much, it's resulting from it, I guess. It's a little bit more of a correlation than cause, so we'll give it like an 8 out of 10. I'd still look at these other two, but I think they both say yes to this. Did its evolution spur the development of new neurological systems? No, it was using the same system that language had, and I wouldn't say that its happening made new systems. It was already in a system that was growing as the brain was getting bigger. Why did it vary so greatly among different individuals? I don't think we really addressed the root cause of musical ability and why some people seem to have more of it than others. So they're not going to have the same answer here. 8's it. 8 is the one that they both seem to say yes to. And by the way, you can always look back at the stems on these agrees or disagrees and see if they're softened up. Like if it's not stated that they would agree, but it's just kind of like they seem really likely to agree, that's good enough in this case. And so checking the stem out can make you feel better about C. Question 13 is asking us to find a principle that underlies arguments in both passages. And they both relied on research or scientific studies, I suppose, neurological studies in the first case and the images of the babies and mothers in the second case. Other than that, though, I don't really see much they have in common. So I don't think the answer is going to say that studies are useful, although that's a principle that they both rely on. And so this is tough to anticipate. Let's just dive in and we'll look at the answer and ask ourselves, does this seem to underlie both passages? Investigations of evolutionary origins of behaviors must take into account the behavior of non-human animals. I don't recall that being a principle they seem to adhere to. We didn't talk about anything besides humans here. All human capacities can be explained in terms of evolutionary advantages. Well, no, the author of A is arguing that music has no evolutionary advantage, and yet it's certainly a capacity, and so this it explicitly does not underlie A. The fact that a single neurological system underlies two different capacities is evidence that they evolved concurrently. The author of A believes that, but I don't think that underlies B. So this is in A but not B, and this one is in B. No, I wouldn't even give this to B, but this is definitely not in A. The discovery of the neurological basis of human behavior constitutes the discovery of the essence of that behavior. I don't know what they mean by essence here. Just because you know what part of the brain it comes from doesn't necessarily, we don't know the essence of the production of music. This is a weird word to use and I don't like it. I think they're just trying to trick you with language on your way down to the bottom. The behavior of modern day humans can provide legitimate evidence concerning the evolutionary origins of human lullabies. Well, yeah, because we studied modern day humans, right? This is close to what I anticipated actually. Studies are useful. We studied modern day humans in both of our studies. We took pictures, fast frame rate pictures of mothers and their babies. That's how you know that one was modern day. And then up here, neuroimaging studies. We haven't been able to scan the brain since before like the 1980s, and so that was definitely modern day as well. So you may have to like infer that. You may have to say, oh, these are obviously, I don't know if they called them out as modern day, but you need to recognize that neuroimaging studies are a recent phenomenon, and so is high-speed photography, and that's good enough to get into E. Question 14 is asking us to characterize a relationship between the two passages. In general here, you should think about their main relationship if they have a reasonably obvious one. And here it's disagreement. A says music has no real evolutionary advantage. B argues that it does. And so they are disagreeing at the level of the main point. That would be a good way to, anytime you leave a comparative passage set like this that have a disagreement like this, you want to recognize, hey, these are in fundamental disagreement. And so passage A and passage B use different evidence to draw divergent conclusions. Definitely use different evidence, and they do. Divergent in this case is like contradictory, and that's absolutely the case. They have contradictory conclusions about whether music has an evolutionary advantage. And so I like this, like 8 or 9 out of 10. I would be looking for reasons to get rid of the others. I might look at all of them, but I wouldn't want to spend too much time. If I was going to like anything else, it's got to be a 10 out of 10, right? So A poses the question that B attempts to answer. I don't see that. They're in fundamental disagreement. A proposes a hypothesis that B attempts to substantiate. This makes it sound like they're agreeing. They're not. A expresses a stronger commitment to its hypothesis than does B. I don't think A is any stronger. They're just headed in opposite directions. A and B use different evidence, true, to support the same conclusion, false. And so that's how you should feel about B through E, and A is the one you want to like here.